Hello, welcome to WCC Wednesday. Today I am joined by a colleague who is going to be talking about Latinx churches in Wisconsin, and I'm super excited. We were talking before we got online, and so there is a lot to talk about. Can you first introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Sergio González. I'm an assistant professor of Latinx studies at Marquette University.
And tell me a little bit about what you study.
So I'm a historian by training. I study U.S. immigration and labor, and my research focuses on the place that I call home here in Wisconsin. I'm really interested in the way in which Latinx people have come to the state, and most importantly, how they've built community and social movements to fight and demand a full sense of dignity and respect in the state. And I'm most interested in the way in which they've turned to churches and religious institutions to do that. So my work looks at the entire 20th century, going back to the arrival of the first Mexican migrant workers in the 1920s and moving all the way up to the late 20th century with the U.S. sanctuary movement across the state.
So you reached out to us and had a conversation with our executive director a month or two ago, I think, but this wasn't your first time working with our ecumenical network. You've worked with some of our partners before. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you did with the sanctuary movement and that research?
Yeah, so, when I was a graduate student in Madison in the mid 2010s, I was working on this large, thesis project. And in 2016, I had just finished up a chapter on the sanctuary movement in Milwaukee, which was a movement in the 1980s, a solidarity movement in response to the influx of hundreds of thousands of people from Central America, El Salvador and Guatemala, people who were fleeing revolution and war and arriving in the United States and were being denied asylum. They were being denied refugee status by the US government. And in the 1980s, churches opened up their doors as places of sanctuary in support of these individuals. In 2016, some of the viewers might remember, our country was in obviously a massive state of flux with the incoming president and kind of the fear of detention and deportation that a lot of people were feeling in our undocumented communities. And so there was a call that rang out from our undocumented sisters and brothers across the United States, calling for a rebirth of that sanctuary movement, basically asking religious spaces to again do this work of serving as places of safe harbor for those individuals that had lived in their communities for years, for decades, and yet were now fearing being ripped away from those very social fabrics. And so in Madison, we heard that call. And as a graduate student, I jumped into the organizing work. I was really fortunate to work with a number of clergy and laity in the city and in the Madison area who were really moved to do this work, social justice, immigrant justice work. And so for a year and a half, I became an organizer and I went to different congregations and synagogues across the area and helped them engage in discernment processes, basically to think about the way in which they could do this justice work, to really live out the scriptures, which ultimately call us to welcome the stranger wherever they are.
That's definitely like we think about doing graduate work, and this is a whole, like bring it to a whole nother level of getting that academy out into the community.
I have, it's always been hard for me to distinguish the difference between the academy and the public. And of course, I think that's one of the things that does a disservice to all the work that we do as historians or other scholars, which is we spend so much time digging through archives and writing articles and writing books. And then the question is always like, who cares? So what? And I think as scholars, we always have to be thinking about the ways in which we share this information with other people, not just so that it's useful information, but more importantly, that people understand that this history is part of who they are, and that understanding this history can really help them understand what the world in which they're hoping to create can look like moving forward.
Yes. So tell us now a little bit about your current project and your current research you're working on.
Yeah, so I'm trying to take that dissertation and transform it into a book now that I'm a professor at Marquette. And the book will kind of look at the entire scope of the 20th century. And so I'm really interested in how Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Central Americans who have come to Wisconsin over the 20th century have often struggled to fully feel like they're members of the communities in which they're arriving. They've often come here either as political refugees or even more often looking to work And they have really been like economic necessities in the places that they're arriving. And yet, even though they are needed in the spaces where they're making homes for themselves, they're not fully integrated. They're not being invited into those spaces. So whether it's industrial workers arriving in Milwaukee in the 1920s, or migrant farm workers in the rural parts of our state in the 1950s, or Central Americans arriving in places like Milwaukee or Madison in the 1980s. I'm interested in how those individuals have often looked to church spaces as places of community formation, and how it hasn't always been a very clean and progressive experience. At a time, there's been a lot of contention, and that Wisconsinites, and specifically white Wisconsinites, have not always been the most welcoming towards these communities.
So can you throw in a question we didn't really talk about, but thinking about, can you give me a little snapshot of what Latinx and Latinx churches look like in the state of Wisconsin? I think we often get this idea of like, oh, the big cities are diverse, but that's where people live. Can you tell me a little bit what the state of Wisconsin looks like?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to remember is that the 2020 census came out, and we know that there was an over 30% jump in our Latinx population in Wisconsin. Other than Asian descent people, Latinx descent people are the fastest growing population of the state. Latinx people are now the largest minority group in the state of Wisconsin. And this is certainly not just an urban story. Latinx people first arrived here in Wisconsin, first kind of settled here in Milwaukee in the 1920s. And so it was an origin story in urban space. But they've been arriving in rural spaces ever since the 1930s, often to work in agriculture. Sometimes they came as migrant workers, so they would just kind of arrive and then leave at the end of the season. But oftentimes they stayed and they planted themselves in the places in which they'd arrived. Today, we see Latinx populations growing in every part of our state, from Milwaukee and Madison and Green Bay to Arcadia, La Crosse, and Appleton. And so any county or any town that you can think of, there's a growing Latinx population, which means that people bring with them not just themselves, their bodies and their labor, they're also bringing their ideas, their language, and of course, their faith as well. And so that diversity of experiences is arriving all across our state. I think the one thing that people still make too big of an assumption of is that Latinx populations are Catholic by nature. And even though, if we think of denominational breakdown, the majority of Latinx people are Catholic, many of them are not practicing. And then, of course, I think that the biggest area of growth in Latinx faith, of course, is in Protestant denominations, and probably even more rapidly in evangelical faiths as well. And so just as we think of Latinx people as being diverse, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Colombian, Guatemalan, of different documentation statuses, different length of residence, their faith experience are, I think, just as diverse as well.
I worked in a Spanish-speaking church for a while, and I think we had people from like 10 countries and background from Catholic all the way to evangelical. And it was just such a diverse space that I think often gets flattened out when people think of Latinx churches.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's indicative, I think, in the way in general, Americans look at people who they deem to be different than them. It's just an effort to try to categorize people cleanly into specific boxes. And of course, the Latinx individual has always been placed as, predominantly Mexican, and their documentation status is iffy, and, they speak Spanish. And some of those things are true, but in reality, the different kind of pathways that bring people to Wisconsin and the ways in which they make home here are just really, really different.
Yeah. So why is it so important for us to know about the church's historic support for migrant workers, to know this history of the church? Why does this matter?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that connection between immigrant and Latinx population in the church has not always been one of support, right? So that's the first thing I think to note, is that there's not kind of this clean story of progression of how churches came to meet Latinx people and immigrants and openly invited them into their churches, that it was often a lot kind of a bumpier ride. And that Latinx populations often had to fight for their space, and they had to kind of demand for a particular form of integration into these spaces. I think the story of the 1960s and 1970s is indicative here, right? So you look at the way in which Latinx people in places like Milwaukee would often go to churches and would say, my grandmother goes to church every single Sunday. She gives every last penny that she has as her tithe or donation to the church. And yet the church has not done enough to care for the poor. to help the unemployed, to support like a welfare system to help our impoverished communities. And so the call is often for a form of self-determination, which is to say that Latinx people should not be given charity by churches. They should have an active role to play in the way in which they interact with the church. That the church should be inviting in kind of all aspects to Latinx people, which means that Latinx people should be clear stakeholders and leaders in their congregations. And so it's important to know that what's happening today in 2022 in churches, whether they're Protestant or Catholic or evangelical, that those fights, those struggles, those conversations have been going on for quite a long time, and that we can become really kind of, I think, myopic if we just think about these as new arrivals interacting with the church. In fact, we've been in this talk for quite some time.
Yeah, I think people would be surprised if whatever denomination you are, if you were to do some research in there and ask, is there a Spanish-speaking church in my denomination? Mm-hmm. The answer is probably yes.
Right.
Somewhere in Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and this, of course, disrupts the idea that Wisconsin is only a white space, even in the rural parts of our state, right? Where those Latinx communities are perhaps much newer, but there are parts of our state that maybe 10 or 15 years ago were predominantly white rural spaces, and on ours, they look very different. And which means that the future of those spaces is going to be very different. So it's incumbent upon all of us to think about the longer history in which that story is a part of and what our role is moving forward for those places.
So if people wanted to learn more, what should they do?
Well, in a form of self-serving promotion, I would tell them to read history.
This is your chance.
It is my chance, right? Historians are not generally good self-promoters. I wrote a book when I was in graduate school called Mexicans in Wisconsin through the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. I think it offers a good kind of popular history introduction to part of this history. I'll note that it's only a very short history of Mexican descent people. It certainly doesn't cover the experiences of Cuban Americans or Puerto Ricans or Central Americans. I think individuals should do a little bit of digging at what their faith spaces are doing, right? Their congregations, their religious homes are doing to become more welcoming spaces for immigrants. I've been really heartened over the last 10 years to see more and more congregations think about their obligations to engage in this work. Some churches have been doing this for a long time. I mean, obviously the Catholic Church has been thinking about this for 60, 70 years. The National Council of Churches and its state affiliates have been engaged in this work since the 1920s, right? And so that's over 100 years in which these large religious bodies have been, extending a reaching hand to immigrant and Latinx populations and trying to think of ways in which they can engage in this work. So if people are interested in getting involved, they can, first of all, they should find out if someone in their church is already doing this work. And if not, to understand that the barrier to do the work is not very hard. I think most importantly, that people should understand that by the very nature of being Christian, or even of being Jewish as well, our scripture, our holy books already kind of give us the imperative to do this work. So the hardest thing, which is to find the justification to spend time and resources on this, is already covered, right? I mean, both the New and the Old Testament give us a very clear charge, which is to welcome the stranger as if he were Christ among us. And so people don't really need any more than that to start getting involved in this work.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I look
Thank you for having me.
Continuing this conversation as we continue.
I appreciate it. Thank you.